Welcome here first. My name is Sheen, and I am a member at large of the Reading and Vocabulary Interest section at TESOL. It is my great pleasure to meet you all here today, and also my great pleasure to introduce you Professor Alison Kuhner, who will give us a presentation titled Reading Like a Writer, Using Readings to Teach Grammar. All right. A brief intro of Professor Kuhner. She has an undergraduate degree in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree in literature from the University of Chicago. She also earned an English credential through the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's in reading instruction at Cal State East Bay. So I know like our time is precious, so I will stop here and give the floor to Professor Kuhner, who can talk more about herself to you. All right, welcome everyone again.
Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for that introduction. I want to give you an overview of what we'll do in this session. And thank you everyone for taking time out of a Friday, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, or Thursday evening to be here. I will briefly introduce myself. Then I wanted to talk about reading and writing, particularly at the college level, which is where I teach. But I think those theories are applicable at any level. We're going to engage in a reading activity. I want to then step away and talk about using readings to teach grammar, which is really the focus of this session. We'll also have a little writing activity, and then I'll leave you with some teaching suggestions and some resources if you want to explore more some of the ideas that have been presented. So this is me. You can see me. I've been teaching for 30 years at a California community college in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have quite a diverse student population, which is very exhilarating and fun to be in the classroom with those students, or even on Zoom nowadays. Students range in age, they range in backgrounds. Many are English language learners. They come from all over the country. We have a lot of international students. We also have a large deaf population at our college. I think perhaps maybe one of the reasons I was invited here is I have written a textbook about integrating reading and writing, which I'm pleased to say is going into the second edition. It's really aimed at transfer level first year writing students, particularly students who might be a little bit unprepared. I think we already did put some introductions into the chat, so it's great to see where people are from. I'll also say, feel free to put questions in the chat as I go through. I may not be able to answer them during the presentation, but then they'll be there and we can certainly have time at the end to address your questions. And I really feel honored and appreciate having this time with you this morning. So thank you for inviting me here. Let me talk a little bit about college reading and writing and how they intersect and what the expectations are for students. As you may know, college texts, college level readings tend to follow certain academic conventions. They aren't personal narratives that are written in isolation. They tend to be driven by research, driven by theories, driven by ideas that already exist in a field. And so authors are stepping in to engage in a debate or a dialogue. And the expectations are that they will acknowledge other people's ideas and give credit to them. And in college, from a student's point of view, they have to read these texts and then they also have to write about them. And typical kinds of writing activities. Summary might be a basic place to start, but pretty soon students need to be able to analyze maybe the arguments, the logic, the use of evidence. They need to draw together various sources. They have to present original arguments, and often they have to do their own research, whether that's through the library or firsthand research. So quite a lot we expect of students at the college level. They have to master these academic writing conventions, and they also have to learn how to read these pretty dense academic texts, or at least full of ideas and content that they may be unfamiliar with. The wonderful thing, though, is the kind of reading they're doing often mirrors the kind of writing we're asking them to do. So a simple example is if students are reading journal articles or writing or to write a research paper, they're seeing how researchers put together their thinking. They rarely read sources that aren't drawing together other sources, and then they have that task to do as well. So there's a nice symmetry there between the reading they're being asked to do and the writing they're asked to do. And this is where we can really kind of leverage that and have students look at texts in those two different ways. They can read a text like a reader, which means coming at the text and understanding the main ideas, being able to have ideas vis-a-vis what the author is saying. So they have to be able to respond to the writer. They may be asked to analyze the evidence, evaluate arguments, and draw connections between texts. So those are the job of a reader to do those sort of tasks. But we can also look at texts from a writing point of view to learn sort of what it is that writers are expected to do at this sort of academic, to engage in this kind of academic discourse. And here I'd like to give you a quote from Professor Mike Rose. He's from UCLA. He is an English professor, and he spent much of his career working with students who were coming in as freshmen and didn't always understand the moves that academic readers and writers make. And he spent a career kind of studying them and writing books about them. But I love this piece of advice that he gave in an interview, where he said to students, when you find authors who write well in your discipline, or people who just write well, a favorite novelist, read them and read them like a writer, rather than reading them like a reader. In other words, read them with an eye to figuring out what it is they do that makes their writing work so well. You read them analytically, you read them with an eye to stealing a trick or two. And so that's really his advice to how you can empower students to be stronger writers by looking closely, carefully at what they're reading and understanding it, and then translating that into their own prose. And that concept is going to be the basis for much of what I talk about. Okay. Grammar is also in the title of this talk. So I want to take a moment to focus on what is meant by grammar, again, in the context of academic discourse. And we can use the readings to really help students understand what are the conventions, what's the grammar of academic prose. And when I mean grammar, I mean the writing at the sentence level. We're not talking about how do you organize a piece of writing, how do you support a thesis, but what's happening at the sentence level in writing. And what we want students to master is using the language effectively, using it correctly, so that they can communicate their ideas clearly to their audience. So really, grammar and the teaching of grammar should make students more effective writers, and maybe also help them to edit their own writing so they can become more effective writing. So those are the basic principles of why I feel we should be emphasizing grammar for our students to make them stronger writers. Now, we expect a lot of our students in college. They need to know, they need to have correct prose. We don't want errors. We don't want them to be making, mistakes with the language. But there's also conventions that we expect to see in academic writing. For instance, parenthetical citations, acknowledging sources, quoting, integrating quotes. We expect a certain level of sophistication in their sentences, that they'll be able to emphasize ideas, write complicated sentences if necessary, as well as punctuate ideas with clarity. They need to use words that are precise and accurate to express their meaning, And then there has to be a certain tone and voice. Usually it's an objective kind of third person that we expect to see. So students don't often come into the classroom knowing all these conventions, and we need to help them learn them, master them, so they can engage in academic discourse. So I've talked a little bit about the relation between reading and writing, reading like a reader, reading like a writer, and grammar. I'd like you to engage a little bit. I'm going to put a link here in a chat to a Google Doc. I will show you the Google Doc and you can get into it at the same time. We're going to read this article twice, but first we're going to read it like a reader. And if you can't see this, click on the left. There's an article, there's a link to this article, or if it's more comfortable, you can scroll down here. Okay. I'm going to need to make a lot more spaces in here because I see there's a lot more people than I had anticipated. But what I'd like you to do is read this article about teaching grammar and look at the main ideas and find a compelling idea, just one, because we don't have a lot of time. Put the author's idea here. You can summarize it or quote it. And then what your response is. Why did you pick that? What's your reaction? Let's just take a quick peek at what people were able to write. It looks like, yes, I'm sorry that you haven't been able to get in here and maybe push your comments down. But from what I am seeing, it looks like most people are in agreement with some of the ideas, or the ideas in the reading resonated with you. So as you can see, most people are saying that yes, or I agree with this point. So, here's a comment. Many errors disappear from student writing when students focus on their ideas and trying to sound correct. That was an idea that somebody agreed with. Or teaching grammar by having students play with the language to communicate their ideas rather than focusing on mechanics is also an idea that people like. So yes, thank you, Sergio, too. One of the reasons I actually do activities like this is students can not only engage with the text, they can see what their classmates say. Then we can almost have a little conversation on the document and also take a look at the document as well. But we're going to step away. This is just a little interlude, so you got a taste of what the article said. You got a sneak peek at what some of your fellow seminar people are thinking about this, and my skimming of the document makes people think that there's a lot of agreement with what the author is saying, which is good because I agree with that text too. There was a reason that I gave it to you. I think that many of the ideas in there are backed by research and are valid. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about grammar and how to teach grammar and what research has said about teaching grammar. So perhaps it will come as no surprise that teaching grammar in a sort of formal skills-based way where you put students through grammar exercises is not a very effective way to teach grammar to students. As a matter of fact, it seems to have a harmful effect on improving writing. And that comes from not just that first Braddock study, but also from a later one, more up to date. And I think the thinking behind that is that grammar tends to make students too worried about making errors. And when they're only focused on making errors, they don't do other things we want them to do in their writing, like express their ideas or take risks or try to stretch their vocabulary or their sentences to write sophisticated sentences. Everything sort of gets compressed and diminished if students are worried too much about grammar. And then students don't really like grammar instruction. It's not a lot of fun for them. Fortunately, it's a lot more fun for most students to read and write than it is to spend time on grammar lessons. All right. But I think that it's not like we need to throw out grammar instruction completely. Hillocks and Smith, this meta-analysis that was done and actually mentioned in the article that I asked you to read, one can use a grammar handbook or grammar instruction sometimes like you would a dictionary. If you don't know how to spell a word, you go and look it up. If you're making errors, you don't know when you should use which or that, you can go and look it up. So if there's an issue, a problem, then perhaps grammar can come in to intervene. But the idea that one should teach all the rules of grammar before one sits down and writes is really not the best approach. Okay, so what is a good approach? Well, the National Council of the Teachers of English have basically endorsed two methods of grammar instruction. One is sentence combining, which I'm not really going to talk about, but basically you take sentence parts and you manipulate them in various ways so students learn how to write more sophisticated sentences and link ideas logically. The one I am going to focus on is this idea of imitating sentences, particularly in readings, so that one builds a repertoire of writing that is more sophisticated. So I will just call that the modeling or imitating approach. Let me take a pause here and tell you why I think this works. Many years ago, when I was in high school and college, I worked as a lifeguard. And one of the jobs of a lifeguard is to ensure that children don't run on the deck and slip and fall and hurt themselves. So as a lifeguard, if you see a child running, you point at them, you blow your whistle and you say, don't run, don't run. And I used to do that. And the child would look up at me and I knew that they knew I was yelling at them, but their little legs would just keep moving. And it was a little frustrating. Until one of my colleagues said, you know, Allison, when you blow your whistle, instead of saying don't run, why don't you say walk? And I said, that's a good idea. I'm going to try that. So the next time I saw a child running on the deck, I blew my whistle, I pointed at that child and said, walk. And they looked at me and they slowed down because they knew what to do, because I had told them what they needed to do. And that's a very simple analogy, but I think it also gets a lot at the heart of how we can teach students to be stronger writers. Rather not telling them what they shouldn't do and all the errors that they could possibly make. Let's show them what they can do, what's possible, what we want them to do in their writing. And how you can do that is by looking at examples and understanding those examples so that they can emulate those examples, so they can use those in their own writing. And yes, they can experiment and they can play and they can have a little bit of fun with this as well. And really, the idea that I think we need to communicate to students, because they haven't always heard it, is that grammar is about making meaning. It's about communicating to your audience. It's about fulfilling expectations so your readers will pay attention to your ideas and won't be distracted by other issues. And that's really what we want to give to our students. And analyzing other people's writing, like Mike Rose said, can help them do that. And it can also help them be better readers. So I'm going to actually kind of walk you through what I do with my students in order to use readings to help them be stronger writers. First, I usually identify a kind of sentence that I feel they don't have in their repertoire and that would be valuable for them. And I look for those kinds of sentences in the reading because they're reading those sentences, they need to understand them. And then often in academic prose, they're reading academic prose, they're having asked to write academic prose. There's that mirroring that needs to happen. We can understand why an author is using that sentence in the context of a reading, in the context of the sentence and also in the whole context of the reading. And then you can have students hopefully grasp that concept, see how that writer is using that sentence and try it out themselves and just practice and play and repeat until they really master it. No tests, it's just writing. Here's a text that I used to use in my class about the marshmallow experiment. If you know, it was this experiment done many years ago over at Stanford University, so just across the bay from me, by a man named Walter Mischel. And preschool kids were given a marshmallow, and then they were told if they could wait 5 minutes while the researcher was out of the room, they would get 2 marshmallows. They couldn't eat the one they had. Some students just ate, some kids ate the marshmallow, some waited. And he developed this theory about delayed gratification based on the fact that the students who waited tended to have better life outcomes. Anyhow, in this article, the very first sentence identifies Walter Mischel. And notice I underlined PhD, a psychologist now at Columbia University. Technically, that's in a positive, right? And we can talk about what's that phrase doing after Mischel's name? Why is it there? And usually students will figure it out, right? It's there to tell us who he is, give credentials to him, show that he's an expert, right? And then later on in the middle of the article, we see another sentence that mentions some other researchers, Casey and Mischel again, and Shoda. And now notice, oh, Casey's got a same sort of phrase after his name, and so does Shoda, but not Mischel. And so what are those phrases doing there? And why doesn't Mischel also have that a positive? And from asking questions and looking at the text, students can usually figure out, oh, first mention of an author, you give their credentials in a phrase following their name. You give their full name. After that, you don't need that. You just mention them by last name. So by kind of looking carefully at these sentences, students learn what appositives are and how to use them in writing. And so these are the sort of questions I would ask, right? Why is there this underlying information? How is it included? Like, notice the commas. When is it included? How often is it included? Not very often, right? And how would you use this, right? You're going to be writing your essay about the marshmallow test, and you're going to be mentioning people who came up in the reading. Could you use this in your writing too? And then I would have students practice, right? Write some sentences where you're talking about the researchers, and we don't only look at Walter Mischel, we look at some research that pushes back on the marshmallow experiment as well. And then they can just practice a little bit using the positives. And that's what we do. We read, we write, we notice, we analyze, we practice writing. And what I look at really is what students do in their finished papers that they turn into me. I don't test them on grammar. I look at their writing. And I'm not going to maybe read all of these, but they are different students writing on different themes from different points of the class. And here's one that came right after the marshmallow test. We did a unit on happiness. Now you notice the student, mentions the researcher, drops in a positive, then goes right on. We had talked about how subject verb is often interrupted by the appositive. And then she drops in a quote, right? Later on, like in this last one, when we read the book, The Other Wes Moore, there's two people, Wes Moore, the Rhodes Scholar and decorated veteran, and then the other Wes Moore who's serving a life sentence. And this student used depositives to identify both of those in a sentence. So those are the sort of like sophisticated moves that we want to see our students doing in college, and that they can learn from close analysis of the kind of reading that they're doing and use them in a variety of ways in their essays. There isn't research that backs us up the way there's research that says traditional grammar instruction doesn't work. But there is the NCTE who says, hey, modeling not only helps students be better writers, it helps them be better readers because they're attending closely to what they're reading and understanding it and understanding what that writer they're reading is doing and why. And then they can reproduce that in their own writing and they know why they're doing it, right? It's not just a rule. They understand the thinking behind the rule. And again, this is an academic convention. When you introduce people, you want to give their credentials and let your reader know why they're worth quoting or summarizing. Joe Williams, who taught at the University of Chicago for many years in their writing lab, said that modeling is a first and natural step in growth as a writer, just in the same way that artists might paint masterpieces to kind of hone their skills before they go off and do their own thing. And I think that's a wonderful analogy. Now, one can also do this with punctuation, and punctuation can solve some sentence problems and some errors. Like, I almost always have students who write run-on sentences. And I think it's a lot because they use commas and they don't use semicolons. And sometimes they don't know how to use commas either. Anyhow, you can do a very similar activity. You can look for punctuation. How does a sentence incorporate a certain kind of punctuation? You pay attention to that, and then you can emulate that in the writing. So again, the emphasis isn't on correctness, it's on meaning. And so here's a little kind of activity I give to my students. You might have seen this. The line is that a professor gives the students a sentence and tells them to punctuate it. There's no punctuation there. And then the men write, woman without her man is nothing, which basically says woman is nothing unless she has a man. But then the women write, women without her man is nothing, which basically says the complete opposite. So it's just a little bit of a joke there, but basically the punctuation, it's not the words, it's the punctuation that makes those two statements completely opposite. It doesn't happen all the time in the writing, but punctuation can help emphasize and communicate your message. And I think that's the most important thing we can tell to our students. So again, quickly, let me show you that I now read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah at the end of one of my classes. Students love it. It's a great book. Noah's a really funny guy, but he also has a serious message. And in here, for instance, we're paying attention to the colons. Colons are things that students don't always use, but can be very useful, particularly for introducing quotes. And so we would look at cases where Noah uses colons, and then I would ask students to use colons. And again, these are from students, many students, different papers. They use colons in different ways. This comes right at the end of the semester. They're maybe not quite as facile with using colons as they become with appositives, but I rather like this last example. As we see in the book, Noah's mother always returns to the phrase she lives by, colon, if God is with me, who can be against me? So I thought that was a very nice way to put a point on that quote before it gets introduced, right? So the idea is, hey, look, Trevor Noah does this in his writing. You could do this too. And notice the effect that it creates, how it makes statements sort of pop. You don't use them all the time. You use them rarely. And then students will try to get it. Okay. I don't know if we want to go back to this Google Doc since people were frustrated. So maybe let me just tell you what we would do here. And if it's too hard to write on the Google Doc, then you could just drop it into the chat. That might be easier. Right. But down here, oh, somebody's already filled it in. We always have these students who work ahead. On what I'd like you to do now is look at that same article and think of it kind of like as a writer. What do you notice about the language? Is there a certain writing style that you might pick up and show to your students, like, oh, look, this is what this author is doing. And I would like you in your writing to try to do that too. So we'll only maybe spend 5 minutes in here taking another look at this, because I don't want people to be frustrated or distracted. And if it works to put a note on the Google Doc, that's fine. If it works to drop a note in the chat, that's good. If you don't want to write anything and you just want to think in your head, that works as well. And as some people are still writing, maybe I can just point out that quite a few people noticed the use of hyphens and said how students don't often use hyphens or dashes, and maybe you could talk about those, the way that details were added in the middle of that. And that was interesting because somebody said that they teach graduate level writers, and so they saw something in this text that would work for them. Using an analogy, the author did, or the way the author would start sentences with little phrases. So there really are, it's really up to you, maybe, and your students, what you would attend to in the text and what would you would pull out and want to highlight and model with students. And that's one of the things that I think makes this kind of strategy really interesting. I won't show you what my students did, but I do this with them on a Google Doc. I want to kind of wrap up here. I think that using these readings to model the kind of writing you want students to do is a very positive approach. It can be motivating to students and kind of fun and exciting. And it really does integrate reading and writing. You don't need to talk a lot about grammar because a lot of times students can just suss it out. Maybe a little bit of, oh, here's the subject, here's the verb, and something interrupts, right? You could just call it a something. You don't need to get into what's a phrase, what's a clause, blah, blah, blah. So the lessons can also be very efficient. Many of you jumped right into there and seized on things, and students will do the same thing. And it's also a chance to reread the text and really think about it, because some of those sentences that you might be using as models could be really important in the message as well as in the style. And what I find too is that when students start just writing sentences and looking at sentences, when they edit their own writing, they have that ability to hone in on sentences as well as look at the whole big piece, which is very valuable for making the writing stronger. Downside, it's not very systematic. It does take more time and thought on the instructor's part to figure out what you want students to take away from the reading. Sometimes there's not that many examples, for instance, of appositives in a piece of writing. And sometimes the examples can be a little complicated, right? They're not the kind of textbook simple things that one would usually get. But then you're asking your students to read those complicated kind of writing that isn't always perfect, and you can talk about it. Again, why would the author write this way? What is the effect? And how does that author communicate his or her meaning? And so if you want to do this, I think we've sort of gone over this, but you would obviously look at the assigned readings for examples that stand out, as we just did on that Google Doc. You'd want to think about your students' own writing, what would be most useful for them. Where are they as writers? Where do you want them to be? If there's errors in their writing too, maybe you can think of examples that are going to help them solve those errors by giving them examples of ways to write that are more correct and forceful and error-free. And you can give them models not only from the readings, but also from other students' writing, or you can even write yourself. That's kind of fun to do. I usually do this activity in class, introduce it so we can have a discussion. I can guide them through analyzing it and give them even a little time to practice. So it's like, here's the reading, now let's do some writing. And then often they will do a little homework assignment. Maybe we'll do it follow up next week or the next class. I encourage them to use those writings in those sentences in their writing, and just keep doing it until they've mastered it, and accomplished those goals. So I have a couple of resources. I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then we'll have some Q&A because I see there's comments in the chat. I wrote up an article about this in the NAID Digest, and there's a link. I think maybe you'll be able to get these slides that pretty much goes over what I talked about here. The meta-analysis, this one's more on using sentence combining. So if you want another strategy besides sentence modeling, this one's kind of interesting. On middle and high school students. The Hillock and Smith study, which a lot of people look at, this big meta-analysis that says grammar instruction doesn't work. In case you have colleagues who aren't convinced, I would say you should read this, or if you're not convinced, you might want to read this. The National Council of Teachers of English and their recommendations for teaching grammar and how to do it. Ryan Noguchi teaches at Cal State Northridge. And he has a really interesting ideas about teaching grammar without using those words grammar, and really honing in on students' biggest errors. He has a lot of English language learners, so like subject verb agreement is really something you don't want to be making errors with, and how to alleviate problems like that so students aren't stigmatized. And then Constance Weaver, who really works with lower grade students, but has a wonderful enthusiasm for literature and tries to inspire her students to write more richly by looking at the literature they're reading and imitating that. And then Joe Williams, brilliant book, concise, clear, about the grammar of cohesion, of organization, of clarity. And he gets into some very close analysis of complicated texts to do that. So I'm going to stop the slides so we can have a Q&A. And yes, I hope to share the slides because I know they have those links. And you can even link back to that Google Doc. I want to see if people have questions. And I did notice one in the chat about somebody said that students really like the feeling of success when they fill in blanks in a grammar workbook. And I totally agree. I used to have students like that. Unfortunately, those students who were so good at doing those grammar exercises and mastered them so well, when they would write their papers, they were not writing strong papers. They knew the rules, but they really didn't know how to apply them. And they only knew them in very specific, limited cases where they knew they were being tested. Okay, check these sentences for run-ons, and then they could do that. But in their own writing, they might still write run-on sentences. So I think the trick is transferring that knowledge of grammar into writing. And that's very complicated and difficult. And I think if you don't read and write, students aren't going to get there. Right. So I'm sorry if I missed other questions. Please put them in the chat or feel free to unmute. Thank you, Maria. Right. I should say comments too, questions or comments. I would say yes, that in my experience, if you look at this writing my students produce in their essays, for me, that's the test. They are writing stronger, clearer, more academically appropriate sentences because we attend to the text we read in two ways to get the meaning out of it. And so they can respond and synthesize. And then another look at what are authors doing that. And I think that's an important takeaway for students. That's something they can go off into their own discipline. So when they're reading like in biology or business, they might start noticing that there's a certain way that those folks talk to each other, that they, if they want to enter the conversation, they need to learn those subtle cues and mimic them, because every discipline's kind of got a different language. Wow, a lot is going on in the chat, and I'm not sure I can respond to it. Is it applicable in low-level class teaching grammar through reading? You should read Constance Weaver. She does 1 through 5. And again, it's about inspiring people to want to write and want to read. And I think we know at the core, that is what is really going to keep people or students engaged and also build their skills. If they're doing something they hate, and unfortunately, grammar instruction tends to be one of those things, they aren't going to want to do it, and it's not going to be meaningful, and they're going to be resistant. If they're doing something they love, they're going to keep working at it, and they're going to get better. Oh, and there's lots of wonderful ideas I think that people are sharing in the chat too. Does it work? Yes, with low level. Second, yes, I have a lot of, now I don't know what you mean by low level because my students are in college, and so they have some proficiency with English language, but I find that they are good at imitating the language. It's true, sometimes they don't always use the right words, but they understand how to get the phrasing down. I would say half my classes are English language learners, if not sometimes 75%. So yes, absolutely. And again, it's something they can take away. They don't need someone to tell them all the time. They can start noticing. I had one student who used to write down sentences that she liked and kept a little notebook. And then she tried to plug in her own ideas and words to kind of imitate those sentences. And I found that out because I asked her how she was able to produce such beautiful sentences. And she showed me her little notebook. Yeah, the majority, yeah, I think I answered the how many of my students. All right. Oh, the links to those resources in the chat. Yes, I see we have 1 minute left, so let me try to drop some of those resources in the chat. Some of them have links, and so I'll just give you the ones that have links. Okay, and then Shin, will we be able to share these slides? That first link is to my article. Selfishly, I put myself first.
Sure. I just double checked with Nancy at TESOL. So if you could share a link to the whole slides, I mean, for the presentation, we will be able to share it with all the audience together with the recording today. So that, I mean, simply I would say yes, we should be able to share the slides as well. And I would, since now it's 11 a.m. So I would just take this opportunity to thank all of our audience today. And of course, a big thank you to Professor Alison Kuhner. It's our great pleasure and honor to have you here. If you have more questions or want to further explore the topic, feel free to reach out to us at the reading and vocabulary interest section, and we might be able to put you in contact with Professor Kuhner as well. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.